While the four of us had tended to Jodi's devastating injuries and her eventual dying body, the surviving feral canines had returned and were sniffing their fallen packmates. One of them, a big menacing shepherd, bit into the cadaverous body of the dead Doberman I had shot. The second Doberman approached that was most likely the deceased dog's one-time domesticated sibling. The shepherd released its powerful bite long enough to snap and snarl at it, before chowing down again. Realizing there was food on offer, the rest of the dogs closed in and proceeded to scramble and fight over their former packmates' slaughtered bodies. The feeding frenzy in the dark had alerted us to their return. I hadn't stated it yet to the others, but I had been thinking those deceased carcasses could supply us with some much-needed protein. I mean, after all, human consumption of dog meat had been a known taboo in numerous countries while we still had a working power grid. It was common practice in China, Nigeria, and Vietnam. Heck, before the 2018 Winter Olympics, the South Korean government asked restaurants that sold dog meat to stop doing so during the event. Customer demand was so high, it never happened. Jim was devastated and crushed at the horrific death of his girlfriend and was still kneeling over her, mourning her passing, as I charged, rifle in hand, to the sliding glass door. Frenzied and provoked by the abhorrent attack, and now resentful that the fearless hounds were feasting on a potential meal for us, I discharged a succession of gunshots into the darkness of the netherworld. I illuminated the flashlight that was mounted on my rifle and began slowly walking out back. The snowpack was saturated in Jodi's bold red liquid, and I followed the trail out to where the ambush had initiated. The group of carnivores had finally fled the gruesome scene after satisfying their ravenous hunger. There wasn't much left of the slain dogs. Clumps of fur, pools of blood, and shredded and devoured corpses laid beneath me. There was hardly any meat left on the now degrading remains, and the thought of contracting rabies after the dead had been picked apart so violently and ferociously outweighed the rumbling in my stomach. I hoped with full bellies the flesh-eating predators would move on to easier targets now. Securing our location from two-legged monsters was a menacing enough task without having to worry about four-legged hellhounds, who were opportunistic pack hunters. From back inside, I could hear Jim vehemently declare he was not leaving Jodi's decomposing corpse outside to be torn apart by the same animals that killed her. The bacterial infections were already beginning to consume the corpse, and the threat of disease was concerning to Blake. It was too dangerous and laborious to dig a grave during the darkness of doomsday, and he suggested moving her body outside the sliding glass door until morning. Jim was persistent and determined that Blake's suggestion was unacceptable. Walking back in from the frigid conditions, I offered a compromise and said we could move her to the garage. The well below freezing temperatures in there would help preserve and slow down the decay and rotting of his beloved girlfriend's remains. Jim, with tears in his eyes and pain in his face, relented and agreed to my accommodation. Jennifer had retrieved a bedsheet, and Jim and I carefully and delicately placed her lifeless body onto it. He collapsed to the ground, first kissing her cold forehead, before telling her he'd see her again soon, and to have a watered-down fireball on ice waiting for him when that day came. The way he said soon with such an emphasis on that word was a little disturbing to me, but I let it pass, chalking it up to the heavy heartbreak he was experiencing. Jimmy refused to leave her body alone in the garage that night, instead staying by her side, bundled up in a complete state of emptiness. Blake and I ran security watch, albeit much closer to the safety and confines of the house. We were both still apprehensive after the horror that transpired today. Come daybreak, we'd do an extensive search of the surrounding area for any sign of the dogs. Jennifer periodically checked in on Jim in his ever-deteriorating mental state. Occasionally I could hear him inside the garage weeping as he reminisced, telling Jodi of their adventures and the love they shared. It was heart-wrenching listening to him recant their history. Tears began to stream down my raw, exposed cheeks, freezing before they fell off my face. She was like an older sister to me, replacing the vacancy and void in my own life of having a sister who lived 1,300 miles away in Florida. We had camped together, partied together, laughed together, and survived the cataclysmic collapse of society together for 23 days before she was viciously attacked and killed in front of me. With all the horror, danger, and death that had surrounded us, I felt like a lousy brother for not giving much musing of my own blood. I hope she was alive and enduring this punishing existence as best she could. If she had indeed perished, I only pray her demise was quick and painless, and she didn't suffer a gruesome death like Jodi had. The hard truth was, I would never know her fate. She had settled down in the suburbs just outside of St. Pete 2 years ago. Living in a dystopian world, she may as well have lived on another planet. Chances are, I'd never see her again. The thought of preserving in Florida without an electrical grid during the height of humidity and heat in the summer sounded as improbable and unpleasant as living through the bone-chilling and ultra-cold western New York winter. I don't think anyone slept a wink throughout the night. Blake and I definitely didn't on patrol, and Jennifer was preoccupied checking in on Jim hourly. We were famished, exhausted, cold, and just trying to hang on after all we've experienced. Morale was getting low, and that breeds a reduction in productivity and performance. Sleep and food were our biggest needs and a priority. At daybreak, Jim had already begun the back-breaking labor of removing snow and wailing away at the frozen tundra with a pickaxe in the attempt to dig a shallow grave for his love. Both Blake and I offered to lend helping hands, but he adamantly declined, insisting he do it himself, as if it was his final gesture of love to her. Jennifer had warmed up a can of baked beans by the fireplace and brought the now open can out to Blake and I for breakfast. It was the first thing we had eaten in 24 hours, and we were lucky to consume 200 calories apiece. As we took turns shoveling warm spoonfuls of the beans into our mouths, we were both thinking the same thing. I finally conveyed the words and said, "Today is as good a day as any to venture out and find some supplies, don't you think? I can take a snow machine and check neighboring houses first before we extend the search out further." "I'll go," Blake answered. "They're my neighbors, and the ones I don't know by name I know by face. It's safer if I do it. You'll be putting yourself at risk and in harm's way if you stumble into a occupied home and are possibly met with resistance." "You're not going alone," Jennifer declared as she overheard our conversation. "I'm coming with you, and I'm not asking." "I wouldn't dare leave your side," her husband answered. "All right, it's set then," I said. "The two of you voyage out and see what you can find. I'll stay here and keep a lookout and watch over Jimmy." The three of us began to walk out back to inform Jim of the plan, and we started to find him digging a second grave next to the one he had started for Jodi. Bewildered, I asked him what he was doing. He didn't answer or even acknowledge my question, instead swinging the pickaxe with all the force he could muster. "Jimmy, what are you doing?" I repeated, this time in a more stern and rigid voice. "We're going to need another one eventually," he answered as he continued loosening up the frozen earth. "What are you talking about?" Blake asked. "Look at us," Jim shouted. "We're barely surviving. If it's not deranged, homicidal humans, it's savage wild dogs. We barely have any food. We're melting snow for drinking water. This isn't living. This is dying a slow, agonizing death. Face it, we're on borrowed time, and eventually the clock will strike midnight on all of us." Jodi's tragic and nightmarish demise had broken Jim. If this apocalypse was a 15-round world heavyweight title fight, he was throwing the towel in before round 4. I grabbed the handle as he again swung it back over his head and yanked it from his hands. "Look at me," I commanded. "She's gone, and I'm extremely sorry for that. You loved her, but she meant something to me too. She'd want you to fight like hell with everything you've got. She'd want us all to do that. These two standing behind me had to bury their 17-year-old daughter. We're all going to lose loved ones in this sick and evil society. None of us wanted this, but here we are, I said. Blake and Jennifer are leaving ASAP to go scout and search the neighboring houses on the street. God willing, they'll return safely and with a plethora of provisions for us. Things have to get better for us, I declared. You two have roughly 8 hours before sunset to complete your mission and return by darkness. I don't want you guys out there after sundown. It's just too dangerous and unpredictable. Armed with self-defense, 1 walkie and 4 backpacks, I escorted the married couple out front to the pair of snow sleds. Be safe, stay alert, and don't take any unnecessary chances. If you feel the slightest bit uneasy about any location, get out of there and keep it moving. Blake had drawn a map of the street and all the houses that occupied it. He numbered each one numerically 1 through 8, identifying them in order he and Jennifer had anticipated visiting them. Each modest home sat on 2 to 4 acres of land, helping space them out from their immediate neighbors. I patted both of them on their backs, wishing them success and safety as they sped off through the colossal snowpack. The sun was out, and I welcomed the warm embrace on my face as I watched them disappear west down the sparsely inhabited road. I turned my attention back to the never-ending duty of running surveillance and ensuring the security of our refuge. The bodies of the 2 sinners of society that had paid the ultimate price for their transgressions and crimes here now hung from a large oak tree out front, a warning for others who had evil intentions of trespassing and attempting to bring harm on us. Not everyone in the group had agreed with the devilish display I had conjured up, but I tell you, when the winter sun hit the 2 slaughtered corpses just right, it was a magical, albeit unnerving sight. The smoke from our chimney may draw some attention, but once they locked eyes on the mutilated cadavers of horror that hung out front, chances are they'd decide to move on to softer targets. I had visions of adding the carcasses of the dead dogs, too, but before I could, I heard a single gunshot erupt from the backyard where Jimmy was still in the process of unearthing a plot to submerge Jodi's body into. I immediately thought the worst when I heard the discharge of the Mosin Nagant. He was depressed, dejected, and heartbroken. That all changed when I heard him resoundingly exclaim, "Bullseye! I got you!" Still uncertain at what was playing out in the backyard, I cautiously called out to him, saying, "Jimmy, talk to me. What's going on back there?" as I began slowly making my way around. "I nailed her," he shouted. "Nailed who?" I questioned. My first thought was one of the bloodthirsty hounds had returned to the scene of the vicious attack. "Bambi," he yelled out. "I shot her right in the neck." The female deer made it less than 30 yards before collapsing to the snow, covered ground and bled out. The backyard of doom and disaster now had a vast array of human, dog, and deer blood blanketing it. The doe was scrawny and quite lean. A deer hunter would have definitely taken a pass on it from his tree stand during normal times. But these were anything but normal times. We were facing near starvation, and anything of substance was a welcoming sight. "Nice job, neighbor. Quick, let's get it into the garage before the feral canines pick up on the scent," I said. Jim's kill gave us some optimism, a much-needed morale boost for him, for me, for all of us. In just over 3 weeks' time since our small town collapsed into chaos, crime, death, and disruption, we had endured so much. We had lost so much. With any stroke of luck, Blake and Jennifer would be successful on their scavenging expedition, and maybe, just maybe, our group's fortune was starting to change. I mean, it had to eventually. How much death and destruction could accompany us? As Jim and I positioned the deer in the garage for butchering, hanging down headfirst from the rafters, the walkie roared to life. "Team Wolverines to base." "Go ahead, Team Wolverines," I answered. "We're on location at Target 1, proceeding to enter," Blake announced. "Copy that, Team Wolverines," I responded.